Hi, I'm Chris, one of the High Rock pastors. It is wonderful to spend this time with you. We're continuing a series called Bless, Leading with Love, where each week we're focusing on the ways that we can be a blessing to other people. So as we receive the blessings of God, our call is to then share those blessings with others. And we're using the word bless itself as an acronym for each step in this process. B was begin with prayer. So praying things like, Lord, how can I share your blessings with others today? And L was to listen to people and their stories so that we can hear how God is already at work in their lives and truly get to know them. And today's message is brought to you by the letter E for eat, specifically to eat together. Doesn't this make sense that eventually we're going to be talking about eating? Think about it. Eating fills so many dimensions of our lives. It's so much more than just survival. Eating is often social. It can be a big part of our work. Eating can be romantic. And eating often requires planning and preparation. Recently, I spent some time with my family back in the Midwest, and it was amazing how much of our time was revolving around food. We took special trips to our favorite Swedish restaurant. Favorite dishes were served with love as we gathered around my mom's table. We had rich conversations, telling old stories and new stories, catching up on all that life had brought since the last time we were with one another. It is basically what we do. We eat. We eat together. Why does that feel so right? Because in the story of creation, we find how God intended for us to eat together. When we look at the beginning of Genesis, we see that everything in creation has two needs that are central to sustaining themselves. The first is to eat, to provide our bodies with energy needed to live by eating what God had provided. In Genesis, it says, "Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree with fruit, with seed in it. They will be your food." And then the second is to be in relationship with one another. So it's the only thing that was considered bad in the whole creation story is that a human being would be alone. We were not created to be alone. In Genesis 2, we read that God gave Adam a helper, not someone subordinate to man, but someone whom the man can depend on. We were created to be in community and to depend on one another and upon God. So we were created to eat and to eat together. Kendall Vanderslice says in her book, We Will Feast, she says, when we eat, we experience the delight of the created order. We experience the sensory magnificence of our human bodies. We commune with one another. And through this connection with all of creation, we commune with the delight in our Creator as well. That sounds wonderful. And I think we get a glimpse of that created order from time to time. But the problem is that one meal in that garden, in creation, shook all that to the core. There was one limit on Adam and Eve that they were unable to adhere to. They ate from the one tree they were commanded to leave alone. So through that one meal, pain, death, division, selfishness, it crept into the world as the hunger for self-reliance outweighed our hunger for God and dependence on our Creator. Now that is one seriously bad meal. We can see the evidence of that meal in meals that we've had as well. For example, we've been created to eat together, and yet there are so many things that pull us apart, which make that shared experience difficult and painful. The awkwardness of an elephant in the room hasn't been addressed in years as you gather around a table. Or in the age of COVID, just physically being able to be in the same room as others can be difficult. The political world really destroyed some meals that we've had in recent years where politically opposing ideologies got expressed, maybe heated, and perhaps even led to people storming out from a meal. It could be a work-related meal where there are anxieties about job security or major changes in the company. Perhaps challenges around the vaccination status of those you'd like to gather with. Maybe it's hard to like some of the people who are going to be at a meal. Maybe there's some seriously difficult history. There was a time when I was a pastor up on the seacoast of New Hampshire, and during that time, I would do about 6 weddings a year. I would often get invited to the receptions, which was a real honor. But one thing I started to notice over the years was that I would often get placed at a table that to me seemed like it was someone's idea of a peace summit for the sake of the family, and I was obviously meant to be the mediator. So one time there I'd be, between an uncle who recently inherited the family oil delivery business and who was super successful, and then his brother who recently moved home with his retired parents after a career in nursing came to a sudden end. The brothers obviously didn't really like one another. The weighted comments and snark around the table became pretty awful. There was competition, there was jealousy, there was judgment hanging in the air. It was terribly awkward, and eventually everyone but me migrated to a different table or saddled up to the bar. It was awful. Maybe during these days we're just too busy. Meals themselves just aren't what they used to be. According to one study, 60 years ago, the average dinner time was estimated to be about 90 minutes. Today, the typical family dinner lasts only 15 minutes, with 30 minutes being considered pretty long. I've had times when I couldn't remember what I ate throughout the day because I had never really sat down to have a meal. As I've talked with many of you in our church and outside of our church, it seems like the busyness of our community sweeps us all up. At times, I hardly taste the food. For example, I slammed a burrito in my car the other day and then asked, "Why am I so full?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, I ate something earlier and had totally forgotten." It says a lot that close to half the families surveyed by an NPR study reported that eating together was difficult to do on a regular basis, which is unfortunate because according to another study, kids and teens who share family dinners 3 or more times per week are physically healthier, perform better academically, and are less likely to engage in risky behaviors. And of course, they have better relationships with their parents. In our busy society, I know it can be difficult to find time and energy to eat together. But I want to remind us that our society is also more lonely, isolated, and divided than ever. People are starving for connection. And I know so many of you are hungry and for love and for relationships too, because I've been talking with you. This pandemic has added to that isolation and loneliness in dramatic ways. We are longing to get back to that core essence of who we are in community together and sustained by our Creator and our Provider. Frankly, it seems like we're just having too many bad meals. Let's take a break there and talk about that in the chat or with the people around you. And please feel free to pause the video if you'd like to take some more time. Welcome back. So God created us with the core essence of needing one another and eating together. But it has been twisted in so many ways. To see how God is working to make these things right, let's look to Jesus and how that work is evident in his life. If I asked you to think about the most important things Jesus did during his time on earth, what would come to your mind? I'm guessing most of us would think of things like his teaching and his healing and doing miracles. But did you ever think that part of how Jesus saved the world was by eating and sharing meals with others, eating together. In the passage read to us from the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus was eating with some questionable people. The story starts out with Jesus seeing Matthew, the tax collector, in his tax collector booth doing tax collector things. But Jesus had a different vision for Matthew's life. He said, "Follow me." It was an invitation to reorient his life and to follow Jesus as a disciple. Even today, tax collectors are not a popular group. But in Jesus' day, tax collectors had it worse. They were considered the scum of the earth. The money that they made was whatever money they could get on top of whatever they took for the Roman Empire. So they were not looked on very favorably. So when Jesus called Matthew, a tax collector, to be his disciple, that was a total shock. And notice the first thing that Jesus did after Matthew said yes. Jesus didn't ask him to take a class on how to be a disciple. He didn't get Matthew to start studying the Bible and memorizing scripture. Instead, he went to Matthew's house to eat. And look who else showed up at Matthew's house for dinner with Jesus. More tax collectors, and along with a whole group of people referred to as sinners. Sinners was a catch-all term for anyone they considered a lowlife, like a non-religious person or even prostitutes. You remember earlier when I mentioned how central eating is to our lives, but eating in those days was even more involved. They didn't have fast food, takeout, vending machines, Grubhub, home delivery. Eating was far more difficult and costly. Back in Jesus' day, eating with people was a bonding ritual. Eating was inherently relational. Eating with someone was an affirmation that that person had value and worth. Who you ate with was a statement of who you loved and cared about. Jesus said a mouthful with the simple act of eating at Matthew's house with Matthew's socially outcast friends. In our polarized and divided world, it's amazing to consider that when we worship Jesus, we worship the one who welcomes all to his table, the one who befriends the victim and the victimizers, who sees the image of God in all, especially those society scorns. And this was not an isolated incident. It happened so often that Jesus became known as a friend of sinners and tax collectors. I think you can see that eating was not just something that Jesus did to survive. No, the simple act of eating together was actually central to Jesus' mission to heal and transform the world. Let me say that again. The simple act of eating together was central to Jesus' mission to heal and transform the world. Jesus was a missional eater. Jesus called Matthew and said, "Follow me." And he calls us as well. We are called to follow Jesus in his mission to bless the world by eating together with those who are inside and outside the faith community. Yes, we eat together with one another, but we are called to reach out to those who are perhaps feeling lost and alone on the outside and in need of this kind of connection. You may have heard High Rock being described as a dinner party that got out of hand. Truly, High Rock started with just a small gathering of believers who met in someone's home on High Rock Street. And they intended to start a church. And one of the ways that they worshiped together during that time was through eating. Later, when I joined High Rock Arlington in 2011, we still had a meal after our evening services. After the service, we would have what we called soul food, a sit-down dinner. Everyone was invited. Some of our campuses, like Metro West, continue to make this a priority when they gather. In Arlington, we still call our coffee time after church soul food, but it's kind of different. Back in this time, our time together is time for food. It's for our soul because it's a meal where the church shares it together. And it was about more than just nourishing our bodies. Conversation, laughter, and relationships were built around the food. It was one of the things that made this spiritual community unique in those days. The fact that you could come to church and not just participate in a service and exchange small talk, but actually sit down face to face with somebody and truly get to know them. Many people came and stayed after experiencing this kind of fellowship. Really, this was just being more like the earliest Christians. We see in the early church that eating together was an essential part of what it meant to be the church. In Acts 2, it says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. And then in verse 46, it says, they broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their numbers daily those who were being saved. To believers in Acts, this is just what Christians did. It was an integral part of their identity. And where did they learn to do this? From Jesus. Jesus was constantly feeding and eating with people. We have seen that he dined with sinners and tax collectors like Matthew. He frequently described the kingdom of God as a banquet. It's interesting that the majority of his post-resurrection encounters involve food of some kind. Heaven itself is described in the Bible as a great wedding feast. So it's not difficult to see how God intended food to play a bigger role in the Christian life than we usually think. And of course, Jesus instituted the breaking of bread in the Last Supper as a remembrance of him whenever we, his disciples, gathered together. Remember, it was that one bad meal in the garden, in the creation story, that brought death, suffering, and strife and self-reliance into the world. But this one meal that Jesus offers to us brings us back into order, that fellowship that we are intended for. This meal that Jesus offers brings life through the remembrance of his death and the resurrection for our sake. Jesus offers himself as a meal. Jesus invites us to turn away from the evidence of that bad meal in the garden and the story of creation, which only leads to death, and instead enjoy the bread and the wine he offers that are doing the work of bringing all things back to life. The early church shared this meal with one another, but it was also a place where people were drawn in. It says in Acts that they shared the Lord's Supper and meals together, and that through that they added to their numbers daily. As Jesus fed them, they fed others, and that drew them towards Jesus as well. Kendall Vanderslice, whose book We Will Feast I really enjoyed as I was preparing for this sermon, she wrote, "What is clear, no matter your theological persuasion, is that Jesus wants folks to eat together in his name. Jesus wants his followers to eat bread, drink wine, and feed others, and in that way to participate in the restoration of a deeply broken creation." When we are transformed by the Lord's Supper, we follow Jesus and look for the Matthews who are on the outside looking in and invite them in. The Lord's Supper is not just for us. Soul food is not just for us. It's for reaching out to others and inviting them in. We often say at communion, all who wish to follow Jesus are invited to draw near and take this holy sacrament. The table is open. The invitation is for all. In the same way, Jesus' disciples are invited to embody this, to invite people to our table and to eat with them, to offer ourselves. Henry Nouwen, in his book, Life of the Beloved, writes that each of us are an expression of this meal that Jesus offers. Each of us are taken or chosen by God. We're blessed, we're broken, and we're given to the world. So as we have received this blessing from Jesus, we are called to be given to the world, to be a blessing, to nurture the essence of who we are in the sharing of meals. Eating together as Jesus commanded us to will change and transform us, and that we might slow down, maybe even stop, and give thanks to God for provision, for providing all that we need. We create a space where we can really see others and have time to listen to their stories and how God is at work in their lives. In this, God will often lead us to eat with people who are different from us, to grow our picture of God's kingdom. We become nourished not just by food, but by love and care, so we are better equipped to go out from the table and into the world to love others. I shared a story earlier about a bad meal I had at a wedding. Let me share another one with you. This is a better experience. I sat down at a reception table after a wedding, and the family that was seated there introduced themselves. They shared with me with lots of enthusiasm how they really enjoyed the service and appreciated that I shared so much about Jesus and a Christian perspective of marriage. Some other things were mentioned that made it really clear to me that they were pretty religiously conservative and from a large church in the Southwest. Then, two gentlemen sat down on the other side of me and joined the conversation. One of them was the uncle of the bride who lived in Vermont. In the midst of the introduction, they mentioned that they were partners. They had been partners for 30 years. Okay, my spidey senses started to tingle. Okay, this is my table setup. So I said a quick inner prayer and decided to engage my questions and to listen carefully. I asked the two men, so to be clear, when you say you are partners, do you mean business partners? Oh no, he said, we've been married for 30 years. Yep, this might be awkward with these two sets of people at this table. But I really wanted to be present to best represent Jesus in this moment. So I responded, wow, that is a long time to be married. Good for you. My wife and I just celebrated 10 years. And then I asked the couple across the table, how long have you been married? We ended up having an amazing conversation about marriage, commitment, struggles, victories, seasons of change, caring for others whose marriages were struggling, and then how we wished the very best for the couple we were celebrating that day. This was such a better meal than the other ones that I've had at weddings. Walls were broken down, hearts were open, relationships were nurtured, and every one of us was deeply blessed, all the more for being a part of it. Let's take a break there and chat together. And please feel free to pause the program if you'd like to take more time. Welcome back. I hope you've been able to have some rich conversations and that they can continue throughout your whole week. What I really like about this message is that the challenge to find this new and richer kind of life is not to do something extra. I'm not asking you to add something into your life when it's already packed. It's missional eating and you have to eat. But instead of just filling your belly, you could begin to eat in a way that nourishes your soul, that feeds others in a way that truly blesses them and your relationships. In their book, Right Here, Right Now, Alan Hirsch and Lance Ford talk about everyday missional living for everyday people, and they devote a lot of attention to eating. Here's one of the things they have to say. Sharing meals together on a regular basis is one of the most sacred practices we can engage in as believers. Missional hospitality is a tremendous opportunity to extend the kingdom of God. We can literally eat our way into the kingdom of God. If every Christian household regularly invited a stranger or a poor person into their home for a meal once a week, we would literally change the world by eating. Imagine if every high rocker cleared the table, so to speak, in order to make room to regularly eat with our neighbors or our coworkers or our friends who don't know Jesus. Who knows? Maybe you're already eating with them. It's just that you never really invited Jesus to that table with you. If we were going to bless the world, we need to eat with the world. Perhaps you agree with me that the eating part is easy. However, the eating together seems to have more of a hurdle. We might say, I would love to eat with people, but I wouldn't know what to say. Or I would love to eat with people, but I wouldn't want to make anyone uncomfortable, especially me. Maybe you're not as outgoing or extroverted as others, and maybe you're not ready for a house full of tax collectors and sinners. But almost anyone can sit down to lunch with a couple of friends. And if you're worried about how to have a spiritual conversation, I really don't think it's that hard, at least not as hard as you might think. Remember that the L in bless is for listen. Ask lots of questions so that you can get to know them. I like to ask 10 questions before I share anything or make a statement. So I ask about their family, their childhood, where they grew up. One of my favorite questions to ask is to tell me your life story with the faith thread woven through it. Knowing someone's history is a big part of understanding who they are. And I found that most people are flattered when a friend takes that kind of time and that kind of interest in them. And asking for that faith thread to be woven through is so interesting and always bears fruit, since everyone, even atheists, have a spiritual background. I found that someone's spiritual background is often one of the richest dimensions of their history. Even if that thread is broken along the way or just ends while they're telling you that story, it is such a rich and just a wonderful way to hear about their life. You might be hearing these suggestions and be thinking to yourself, you wouldn't want to make someone feel uncomfortable. Maybe you're actually more worried about making yourself uncomfortable. And that's fair enough. You probably will be uncomfortable. All I can say is that it is worth it. The degree of blessing you can bring to someone's life more than makes up for any discomfort that you or we might feel. One day you might even find yourself looking forward to it. The pandemic is a huge hurdle. I understand that. It is a mixed bag of feelings about gathering these days, especially inside. So maybe eat outside. Set up some chairs in your driveway. Right now it's easy when it's warm and preferably not raining outside. This winter, it may get harder again. One thing Sarah and I did is we bought 4 electric blankets so that we could sit outside. It was awesome to invite people over to eat with us, even though it was freezing outside. If you are limited to doing meals over Zoom, I love what Pastor Kim has done with some newcomers she met through High Rock at Home. While we were unable to meet in person, she would send food to these people's homes in advance so that they could open it together and eat together on screen. So it is still a shared experience and a shared meal. Another big hurdle is I love to eat with people, but I don't have that time. That's probably the biggest hurdle for most of us. Maybe you find it hard to find time for you to eat, or maybe too many of your meals are on the go. In that case, the challenge isn't just the challenge of eating together. The challenge is really about finding balance in your life. If this is you, I encourage you to go back and listen to my sermon from a couple of months ago when I preached about health and living a life to the fullest. You have to know that if you're regularly missing meals, eating at your desk, or living off fast food, your life is probably not healthy or even sustainable. But here's the thing. Maybe missional eating will be that thing that is important enough that it gets you to make room for a more balanced and healthy rhythm of life. One that has more room to love people who desperately need to meet Jesus. There are a bunch of smaller hurdles that we can face. I'd love to eat with people, but I don't like to have people in my home. Well, that might be easy to solve by just eating out. I'd love to eat with people, but I can't cook. One solution might be to get takeout. I'd love to eat with people, but I don't have time to clean up for my guests. Maybe ask your spouse or your roommate, or if you have kids, to invite them to help you. There's also something really special about inviting your guests to participate in the preparation and in the cleanup. I have another suggestion. If you are in a small group or if you are in a pandemic pod with some close friends, maybe you could cancel Bible study or your regular plans once a month to have a meal and invite others in. Or maybe for the summer, you could do cookouts instead of Bible studies. I love this idea. This idea that I heard about where some people have Matthew parties, referring to this scene in the Bible. It's a gathering that intentionally mixes our non-spiritual friends with our spiritual ones. Whatever your hurdle is, whether it is a desire to not make people uncomfortable, or not knowing what to say, or you're too busy, I get it. This part of the challenge is hard. But as I was thinking about this challenge, I had an uncomfortable thought and a question. What does it say about us if we're not willing to eat with people who need to meet Jesus? I mean, how are we any different than the Pharisees if we're not willing to eat with people who need to meet Jesus? Are we contributing to a world that reflects that bad meal in the garden and all that came from it? Or are we having a kingdom mindset, rooted in the joy that we find in the fact that Jesus makes space for us at the Lord's table? So we are given the joy and the opportunity to make space for others at ours, where perhaps redemption is found, where healing is found, where hunger is satisfied, and where spirits are lifted. Let's not forget what's at stake here, and let's not miss this amazing opportunity we have to participate in the invitation and the gathering of God's feasts. Let's take a minute as we close to begin with prayer. So right now, I want to invite everyone to just take a moment of silence and to ask God to lead you to someone this week. Maybe you're already thinking of someone. Take this moment to pray for them. Pray for opportunities to bless your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, maybe even someone as close as a family member, someone as distant as a stranger. Ask God to help you listen, that he might give you insight into who that might be to say right now. That God would give you the words to say, grant you the courage and the love to risk inviting people into your life, into your home, into a meal, and the courage to invite Jesus to that table as well. Take just this moment to bring these requests to God in silence. As we seek to be a blessing in our worlds, remember that Jesus is the path to all good things. He is the ultimate blessing, and he invites us to share our blessings with others. Amen.